So this morning is the first in this five-part series following a course called Simply Christianity. I always like to tell you the sources and so on, the folks that I found most useful in preparation. Sometimes it's something that I just make use of, and well, on this occasion we're actually following a course. So that'll be hopefully helpful, and then in a moment or two I'm actually going to give you a little summary of today's session, and then each week we'll do the same. So this one, as I say, Simply Christianity, I think it was written in the late 90s by a guy called John Dickson. And it's based on Luke's account of Jesus' life and ministry. As I've mentioned in the past, there's one gospel message, but in our Bibles we have four accounts of that. We have four gospel accounts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And over this next month, I'm going to be encouraging all of us, I hope, to read the entirety of Luke's gospel. It'll take you, if you were to sit down and do it all in one go, it would take you about an hour and 15 or an hour and 20 minutes. So if you break that up over a few weeks, then it really is only going to be about 20 minutes or half an hour each week. And hopefully we'll manage to do that. It's probably less than 40 pages long. I think it's 16, 18 chapters. I can't exactly remember. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end of the service, at the end of this message. So I want to start with a story. And it's a story about a small aeroplane, a small four-seater plane. And it was a plane that was having engine trouble. And as it began to fall from the sky, the pilot announces to the three passengers, three very nervous passengers, he says to them, "There's four of us, but there's only three parachutes." Okay, and he continues then, he says, "Well, I'm the pilot, it's my plane," and so he takes the first parachute and jumps out. Okay, now that leaves three passengers. If you're good at maths, three passengers, two parachutes. Yeah, somebody's not going to come off too well in this story. Well, the three remaining passengers, one is a great scientist, one is a Presbyterian minister, and the other is a backpacker, a hitchhiker. Now the scientist, he says, "Well, I have a brilliant mind. If I was to die, that would be such a huge loss to humanity." So he took a parachute and jumps out of the plane. And the minister, at this point, turns to the backpacker and says, "Well, I'm a believer. I'm a Christian. I know that I'm safe for eternity. I know what's happening to me if I die. So you take the last parachute." And at that point, the young backpacker interrupts him and says, "It's okay. That brilliant scientist has just jumped out of the plane wearing my backpack." Okay? Now, you see, the reason I tell that story is because it's easy for us to assume. It's easy to assume you have the real thing when actually what you have is a very poor substitute. You see, well, I guess jumping out of a plane wearing a backpack, with a backpack strapped to your back, that's a pretty extreme example, but the same can be true in other areas of life as well. In a so-called Christian country like Ireland, it's very easy for people to assume that their opinions and their choices about Christianity are based on an accurate understanding of Christianity, and often that's not the case. It's very possible that the version of Christianity that they're rejecting is not the real thing after all, but some very inferior substitute. I know that, well, some of you know that I work in the hospital one day a week as a chaplain. I often meet patients who tell me why they've rejected Christianity. And they tell me about the Christianity that they've rejected. And my response is, well, if that's what Christianity taught, then I would reject it too. They haven't got an accurate understanding. They haven't got the true gospel. So that's what we're after during this little course. We want to know the truth about what the Bible teaches about the Lord Jesus. So it is possible it is possible to believe the wrong thing. And perhaps that's even true of some of us here today. As a minister, I'd be foolish to assume that everyone who comes along to a church service believes the truth or is a Christian. Maybe, even though maybe you're even here regularly, You've been rejecting Christianity because you have a wrong understanding of it. Or perhaps the gospel that you're trusting is not the true one after all. And so our aim during this little series is to make sure that we have a clear understanding. My goal is to give you a clear explanation of what Christianity is really all about. That's why the session or the series is called Simply Christianity. This is not Presbyterian Christianity or Baptist Christianity or any flavour of Christianity. This is simply, plainly, what the Bible teaches is at the very heart of Christianity. And then, well, you can decide for yourself whether the Christian parachute is worth strapping to your back after all. And my prayer is, my hope is that you will realise it is. And if you're a Christian already, which I have no doubt is true for many of you, if you're a Christian already, then I hope that this series will give you a better and a clearer understanding of the gospel message. Because sometimes we, even as believers, we can have doubts, and hopefully this little course will help you with those. But as well, it'll help us to share the message with others, a message that's accurate, and to do that with a fresh passion, a renewed zeal for this gospel of the Lord Jesus. Now, I mentioned there's a little sheet, so pass these around, take one and pass them on. So there will be headings on the screen, but this is a page that you can take away with you. There'll be one each week. If you want to collect them all, you'll have the full set by the end of the little series. Now, Christianity is very entirely different from the world's religions, and different in many, many different ways. Now, one of the main differences is that it's all about a person. Christianity, it says this on your sheet, is for the first heading, I think. Christianity is as the word suggests, is all about Jesus Christ. That's point one on this little summary sheet. And it's very important for us to realize that that Jesus is central to the Christian message and to the Christian faith. In fact, Christianity, both in terms of becoming a Christian and in terms of living the Christian life, could be described as responding properly to Jesus. That's on your sheet as well. Now, you might think all sorts of things about Christianity, much of which is probably true, but we need to be sure. And today we're going to be thinking about how we can be sure. See, if Christianity is all about Jesus Christ, then we need to find out about him. We need to find out what information is available. And that's what we're going to think about. And that takes us to the second point. You'll see there it says information about Jesus. And all of the information about Jesus dates back almost 2,000 years and can be divided up into two main types. You'll see it on the sheet, it says A and B. A is the stuff that was written during or shortly after Jesus' life by people who were not Christians. So that's an important source. And then secondly, B is stuff that's written at a similar time by those who were Jesus' followers. They were Christians. So we'll start with the non-Christian writings. I'm sure if I was to ask you, have you ever heard of Julius Caesar? Or if you've ever heard of Alexander the Great, if I asked you to put your hands up for those, you'd all have your hands up. You definitely would, definitely. But what we need to realize is, not including the Bible, far, far, far more was written about Jesus than either of those two men, or about anyone else during that period of ancient history. Now let that sink in. Even if we didn't have the Bible, there's far more written about Jesus than Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great or anyone else. Far, far more. I want to read to you just a quotation from this guide. It's by a guy called Josephus, who you may have heard of or may not, but he's a Jewish historian. So remember that Jews are not Christians. Jews at that time were very much enemies of God's people, or enemies of of the Christian people. And this is written in 80 AD, within the lifetime of people who knew and met Jesus. So this is by Josephus. Now about this time there lived a wise man called Jesus. Indeed, he was a man who performed startling feats. He was a teacher of the people, and he drew in many from among both the Jews and the Greeks. And those who were devoted to him from the start did not cease their devotion, even after Governor Pilate condemned him to the cross. For it is reported he appeared to them alive again, and the group of Christians named after him has still not disappeared to this day. So less than 50 years later, he was expecting that Christianity as a fad might have gone away, and reporting that it hadn't. And here we are 2,000 years later, still believing those same truths that he's reporting. So that's just one example. We could go through many, many others. And from all of those various different non-Christian sources, we get a very accurate picture, in fact, a very true picture of Jesus' life. And some of the facts are listed on your sheet. Let me read them for you. This is under point 2a. So this is what non-Christian sources actually tell us about Jesus. They tell us when he lived, where he lived, that he was Jewish, that he was a public teacher with much influence, that he attracted great crowds, that he performed supernatural acts known as miracles, that he was executed, when and by whom, that he had a brother called James who was later also executed, that people claimed to have seen Jesus alive after his death, that he was widely known by the important Jewish title of the Christ. Now, all of those are familiar truths for us, but we need to realize that all of those are found in non-Christian sources dating from the time shortly after Jesus' time here on earth. It's only basic information. We have to admit it's only basic information, but it's important information nonetheless. However, if we want more detail, we need to look at the writings of Jesus' own followers. And that takes us then to point B, which is the Christian writings, or the biographies of Jesus' life. Now we all know what biographies and what autobiographies are. Well, Jesus didn't ever write an autobiography. It would be great if he did, but he didn't. Instead, our detailed knowledge about him comes from biographies about Jesus' life written by others. And those biographies we sometimes call the Gospels or the Gospel accounts. Now there's four of these biographies in our Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I've mentioned already, during this little series, we're looking at just one of them. We're looking at Luke's Gospel account. And although it was written almost 2,000 years ago and thousands of kilometres away, and it was written within a different culture, despite all of that, it's actually remarkably easy to read. And by the end of this little series, we'll all know fairly clearly what Luke tells us about Jesus. And all of that should help us to realize how incredibly relevant Christianity is for us today and to our lives. That's probably enough about all of the different sources, the Christian and the non-Christian sources that provide the information we know about Jesus. Probably enough. But if you do want more, come and see me. There's a whole chapter nearly in this book that provides endless information that helps us to see where we get the information that we know about Jesus. The second thing then, we need to think about Luke himself. That takes us to point 3 on your page. It says, who was Luke? We need to think about the author of this gospel. And some of these are listed on your page. So we know that he was a medical doctor. We know that, well, unlike me, he had a keen interest in history. He finished writing his biography of Jesus' life sometime in between 70 and 80 AD, which we need to realize is a relatively short time after his ascension back to heaven in 33 AD. We know from Luke himself that he studied and researched and investigated Jesus' life for many years. Luke never met Jesus, but he spoke to many, many people who had. And he based the biography, the account that he wrote of Jesus' life, he based that on the facts that those other people provided. People who included even Paul. Luke spent many years working with and traveling with Paul. And we know as well that Luke was a highly educated man, well able to take the evidence, to weigh it, and to be convinced and to report that clearly to us. Now, sometimes people have doubts about how reliable the Gospels are. Well, and sometimes they might wonder whether they can truly trust, trust what they read as being true. Well, I can assure you that the evidence to confirm the Gospels as trustworthy is extremely convincing. And if anybody would like to talk some more about that, please do come and speak to me afterwards. So that's a little bit of history, and maybe like me, you don't like history. I hated it. It was my worst subject at school. But we need this little bit of it at the start of this series because it is such an important starting place. And why is that the case? Well, because we need to realize that whenever we open Luke's Gospel, when we do that in just a moment, that it's not some kind of myth or fairy story, but it's an accurate account of real people and real events. So we need to be convinced that what we're going to be reading through this little series is reliable, that it's true. And hopefully what we've seen as well, that much of the main facts of it actually correspond with and fit very accurately with what's recorded by non-Christian writers too. So we're nearly finished. It's time for us to, look at the verses that Diane read for us a moment ago, those opening verses from Luke's Gospel. And remember, this is on the page as well, remember what it says there. Luke's aim was to present accurate and relevant material on Jesus. That little statement's on your summary page or your summary sheet, and we need to. We'll see that again as we look at those opening verses of Luke's Gospel. So if you have your Bible, do turn again. We're going to simply read those verses for a second time. Page 1025. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. And as I read them, think about all that we've thought about and what I've just shared. Luke writes, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Or the translation, I think, that was on the screen when we talked to the kids, it said at that last line, "so that you may know that they are true." What we have as we look in our Bibles is true. And that takes us then to the point 4 on the Bible, point 4 in your sheet says the big idea. And I'm simply going to read this. It says, "Christianity at its heart is not about rules or rituals, but about a person. That person is Jesus Christ. A person that we can get to know through the Bible, or that we can get to know better through the Bible." And during this course, we hope to do that by looking at the Gospel of Luke. And then point 5 is well, it's kind of like your homework. I don't like to say you get homework at church, but it says before next Sunday. I'm going to read. It says, I encourage you to read Luke chapters 1 to 9. Or at least there's an option. If you don't quite manage to read all 9 chapters, it suggests that you read some of chapter 4 and 5, and then from the end of chapter 7 through to chapter 9. But do try, if you can at all, try to read all 9 chapters. And as you do that, there's 2 questions on your sheet. Ask yourself, according to Luke, who is Jesus and what has he come to do? Who is Jesus and what has he come to do? And as you're reading those chapters, if you come across something that's confusing, something you don't understand, if I can help, please do get in contact. I'll do what I can to answer any questions. Let's take a moment. Let's take a moment to pray. Let's bow.